The story began with the female protagonist narrating her own life, an illegitimate child of a wealthy conglomerate family. How romantic did that sound? Especially for a girl. If she had been a character in a novel or drama, she would have been the protagonist of a Cinderella story. But reality was far from fiction. This was neither a novel nor a drama. Her father had once informed his two sons that she would be living in the house from that day onward. They had been told that although she had a different mother, she was still their younger sister and should be taken care of properly. However, she had thought otherwise. To her, she was nothing more than an unwanted child, one who could not even beg for a place to belong. Her life had been better when she had lived with her mother in a tiny room. But as time passed, her circumstances had become so unbearable that she had longed to be sent to an orphanage instead. That child in the family had been none other than her. 6 years later. Years had passed, and now, on a particular day, she entered a room where her eldest brother was present. He had been cursed under her breath as she wondered why their father had assigned him the responsibility of moving her out. It was well known how much he had harassed her in the past. To her, it would have been easier if she had simply been told to live on the streets. She had thought that her father only cared about his heirs, nothing else. Moments later, she landed on her bed, realizing that she was finally free. A feeling of relief had washed over her. She reflected on the suffering she had endured, wondering how long it had taken to reach this moment. Her older half-brothers had persecuted her both at home and at school, and their father had never cared about what they did. The only way she had been able to escape that hellish family was by getting into a prestigious university. And now, at last, her freedom had been won. Her grim days were over. She had vowed to work hard at school, make many friends, and find happiness. The next day at school. The following morning, as she arrived at school, she overheard a group of girls discussing something enthusiastically. They were talking about a game. One of the girls had complained that she was playing on hard mode, yet the affection score refused to increase no matter what she did. Another had responded that the game was likely not designed to be won so easily and that spending money was probably necessary. Curious, she had turned to her friend and asked what they had been talking about. In response, her friend had informed her that it was a game, one that had become incredibly popular. The game was called Daughter of the Duke, Love Project. Late at night, upon returning home, she had searched for the game and examined it. A skeptical expression had crossed her face as she noted how cheesy it appeared. She had questioned how a game with such a name had managed to become a trend. Although she had not been particularly interested, the fact that it was all anyone at school had been talking about had made her curious enough to check it out. As she navigated through the game's interface, she had noticed that it was divided into two modes, normal mode and hard mode. A moment of hesitation had followed as she considered which one to try first. In the end, she had chosen to begin with normal mode, reasoning that it would be the best way to get a general understanding of the game. As the game started, the opening sequence had played. The game's storyline. The introduction had revealed that Yvonne, an ordinary country girl, had just turned 18. However, the truth was that she was actually the Duke's youngest daughter, who had disappeared 6 years ago. Having forgotten her true identity, she had lived as a commoner all this time. But on the day of her return to the household, her life had been overwhelmed with fantastic events and curious new relationships. The objective of the game had been made clear, to win over the various male characters and raise their affection scores while eliminating the meddlesome villainess. Wealth and fame had to be accumulated, and if the affection score reached 100% with any of the characters, a love proposal would be received, marking the end of the game. A skeptical thought had crossed the female protagonist's mind. It had all seemed so predictable. However, she had admitted that the illustrations were quite impressive. Initially, she had planned to stop after a short while and go to sleep early, as she had a lecture the next morning. But time had passed far too quickly, and 3 hours later, she had found herself still playing. An unexpected interest. Realization had struck her. Sleep had been completely forgotten. A question had formed in her mind: how had this game turned out to be more enjoyable than expected? The unique system and strong character lineup had kept her engaged. It had felt strangely familiar, almost as though she had been watching her own story unfold. The heroine had forgotten her identity and lived in poverty until her return to the household. Similarly, she had once been brought into her father's wealthy family. Even the two older brothers who had been wary of their little sister's sudden appearance had been present in the game. Of course, there had been significant differences between her reality and the game's storyline. In the game, the brothers had been among the main love interests, making them somewhat appealing. But playing the game and experiencing their dynamics had been amusing in its own way. Normal mode had turned out to be surprisingly easy. The affection scores of the love interests had started at 30%, making it far from a challenge. In her opinion, it should have been labeled easy mode instead. A new challenge. Eventually, she had reached the end of the game. A notification had appeared, informing her that normal mode had been cleared. She had considered whether there was anything else she could do. Another message had followed, stating that the game's hidden ending could now be purchased. However, the cost had been 100,000 won. She had been completely shocked. The thought had crossed her mind, why was a single ending so expensive? Had there been no other way to access it? Then, she had remembered something, hard mode had been available as well. But it had to be cleared first. It had already been quite late, and she had classes the following morning. But despite that, she had chosen to proceed. The question had lingered, how difficult could hard mode truly be? She had not known it then, but later, she would look back and recognize that her excitement over the previous ending had momentarily clouded her judgment. Normally, she would not have acted so recklessly. A new notification had appeared. The villainess is the heroine now. Penelope Eckhart. In hard mode, the story had developed from the perspective of the villainess, Penelope Eckhart, a fake daughter who had entered the Duke's household in place of the lost daughter. New questions had been posed. What events had unfolded before Yvonne's return? What had Penelope's story been? As hard mode had begun, she had been drawn deeper into a world that, in more ways than one, reflected her own. The female protagonist, after failing once again in the game, threw her phone onto the bed in frustration. Defeat had become a recurring experience, and disappointment weighed heavily on her. It was acknowledged by her that surviving as a villainess in the game was a nearly impossible challenge. Earning favor was already difficult, but with a single wrong decision, everything was lost. The harsh reality of the game dictated that failure was met with immediate and gruesome consequences. Each game over had been accompanied by a chilling depiction of the character's death, adding to the frustration she felt. Her anger intensified as she reflected on how the villainess was perceived. In normal mode, the character had always appeared to be pure evil. However, now that the protagonist had stepped into the villainess's shoes, it had become evident that the character had not even committed any real wrongdoing. Confusion arose within her, why was such cruelty directed toward the villainess? A deep sigh escaped her as she contemplated the injustice of the game. She wished for the character to survive just once, even if only for a moment. The thought occurred to her that, initially, the hidden ending had been her only goal, but over time, a greater attachment to the game had developed. It was no longer just about completing the game, it had become a mission to ensure that the villainess endured the hardships imposed upon her. The ease with which the heroine earned love and admiration frustrated her. In easy mode, affection was given to the heroine effortlessly, while the villainess was doomed to suffer. No matter how desperately the villainess begged for kindness, she was met with rejection and cruelty. The contrast between their experiences was painfully clear. In hard mode, no matter what was done to change her fate, the villainess was destined to meet an unfortunate end. A wave of personal memories surfaced, intertwining with her frustration over the game. A past filled with loneliness and neglect had shaped her understanding of the villainess's plight. It had been pointed out to her, time and time again, that fairness was an illusion. Whenever she had felt wronged, she had been told to seek help from her father. However, such an option had never truly existed for her. Her father had never given her the attention she had longed for. Whether she starved, suffered, or was bullied at school, it had never mattered. Indifference had surrounded her. The painful realization had settled within her that she had never truly belonged to the family she had been born into. A connection to the villainess had been formed within her heart. The struggle of the character mirrored her own experiences, making it impossible for her to abandon the game. Each time the villainess died, the game had been restarted by her. Over and over again, new attempts had been made. However, even as the night passed and dawn approached, success had remained out of reach. The hidden ending, despite all efforts, had not yet been achieved. Yet, a firm resolution had been made: failure would not be accepted. It was decided by her that the game would be restarted as many times as necessary until victory was finally claimed. Exhaustion had weighed heavily on her, and as these thoughts consumed her, sleep overtook her. A voice, distant yet urgent, called out to her, disrupting the silence of her slumber. Repeatedly, she was addressed as "my lady," though confusion clouded her mind. An unfamiliar presence had been sensed near her, and the words being spoken left her bewildered. Uncertainty filled her as she questioned whether the voice had truly been directed at her. The memories of the previous night rushed back, bringing clarity to her disoriented thoughts. Upon opening her eyes, the reality of her situation had been confirmed. Her surroundings had changed entirely. No longer had she been lying in her own bed. Instead, an unfamiliar place had been where she had awakened. It had been realized by her that she was no longer herself. Prayers had been whispered by her throughout the night in hopes that it had all been a mere dream. However, as the new day began, those hopes had been shattered. No matter how much she tried to deny it, the truth remained the same. The transformation had truly occurred. Her existence had been merged with the villainess from the game. She had become Penelope Eckhart. A sharp, stinging pain shot through her arm, causing her to wince. It felt as though her skin had been pierced by something small yet sharp. Upon looking down, a discovery had been made: tiny puncture wounds marked her skin. Confusion deepened within her as she wondered how such marks had appeared. The maid standing beside her informed her that wakefulness had finally been achieved. At that moment, her gaze settled upon the woman, and recognition sparked within her mind. The maid bore a striking resemblance to the lady's maid from the game. Everything about her, the way she looked, the way she spoke, felt eerily familiar. A realization struck her: her current situation had truly been pulled from the world of the game. A sense of unease crept over her as she questioned why such treatment had been given to a sleeping person. Yet, when an attempt had been made to voice her thoughts, no words had come forth. Panic began to rise as she recognized that her voice could not be used freely. The terrifying thought occurred to her that she might be unable to speak unless the game's interface presented her with a choice. This revelation sent a chill down her spine. More details of the game began to surface in her memory. The villainess had always been treated unfairly, but the full extent of the mistreatment had not been realized until now. Every moment spent in this body revealed just how mercilessly Penelope had been treated. The meticulous nature of the game had begun to feel suffocating. Every detail had been crafted with cruel precision. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. From outside, another maid's voice was heard, informing her that breakfast had been prepared. A question had been asked: would she be taking longer before joining the meal? It had become clear to her that no real choice had been given in the matter. Resignation settled in as she understood that this world demanded obedience from her. Memories of her own past surfaced once more. Years had been endured in a house that had never truly felt like home. Now, she had been forced into yet another existence filled with similar hardships. Upon reaching the breakfast table, her eyes fell upon the meal that had been placed before her. A deep sense of disgust arose as the sight of the food was observed. The items appeared far from appetizing, bearing more resemblance to scraps than a proper meal. A silent question formed in her mind: was it truly expected of her to consume such food? At that moment, the interface of the game once again made itself known. 3 options had been presented before her, each dictating a possible response to the situation. The first option involved expressing her outrage by demanding the presence of the cook and flipping the table in protest. The second proposed a more vengeful act, forcing the maid to consume the food instead. The third, and final, instructed her to remain silent and eat without complaint. A decision needed to be made. The consequences of her choice were unknown, but one thing had been understood: every action carried weight. The villainess's survival depended on the paths that had yet to be chosen. Penelope Eckhart found herself in an all too familiar situation, one that she had been forced to endure multiple times before. She recognized the choices before her, as this was a scenario that had been repeated at the beginning of the game. Twice before, she had made the wrong decision, and each time, the result had been her demise. Now, reality had placed her in that same event once again, forcing her to navigate through the treacherous paths she already knew would lead to her downfall. The two options available to her were nothing but cruel traps designed to ensure her suffering. If the first choice were taken, the terrified maid would immediately run to the Duke, reporting the supposed wickedness of the villainess. Upon hearing this, the eldest son of the household would take it upon himself to punish her. She would be locked away in a cold, empty room without food or water, left to starve until her body could endure no more. A slow, agonizing death awaited her in that scenario. The second choice offered no better outcome. Should that path be chosen, the younger brother would coincidentally pass by at that exact moment, witnessing the incident firsthand. Acting impulsively, he would rush forward in anger, pushing her away from the maid. The force of the shove would cause her to stumble backward, and as fate would have it, a stray fork lying on the floor would pierce the vulnerable skin of her neck. The sharp metal would slice through her throat in an instant, leaving her gasping for breath as life drained away from her body. But this was not a game. Unlike before, there was no reset button, no way to go back and correct a mistake. Every decision carried weight, and every action could mean the difference between survival and death. Knowing this, she decided to take an alternative route, one that had never been available in the original scenario. Instead of reacting, she forced herself to lower her head and eat the unappetizing food placed before her. Her body responded automatically, moving against her will as she forced each mouthful down. The taste was vile, and the texture made her stomach churn, but stopping was not an option. However, an unsettling realization soon struck her: she was unable to halt her movements. Bite after bite, her body continued to consume the meal, as though it had been placed under some unseen compulsion. No matter how much she willed herself to stop, her hands refused to obey. The tense atmosphere of the room was suddenly disrupted by the sound of a door swinging open. A commanding voice filled the space, demanding an explanation for the scene that had unfolded. The presence of a man was felt immediately, his authority impossible to ignore. It was none other than Reynold, the second son of the Duke. Frustration and helplessness surged through Penelope's thoughts. Why must this suffering never end? The torment of her past life lingered heavily in her mind, memories of a household that had never once shown her kindness, of food that had barely been edible, and of two wretched brothers who had made her existence miserable. No matter where she had gone, those bastards had ensured that peace remained beyond her reach. Her father's wife had passed away before she had even been born, yet the sons of that woman had treated her as though she were personally responsible for their mother's death. The hatred in their eyes had never wavered, and because of their cruelty, she had suffered through stomach illnesses so frequently that the pain had become second nature to her. She had endured more than enough misery in her life, and yet, even in this fabricated world, one that was supposed to be nothing more than a game, the torment refused to end. Reynolds' gaze moved to the plate of food in front of her, his expression darkening with every passing second. Disbelief flickered across his face as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. An accusatory question was thrown at the maid, his voice sharp with anger. He demanded to know what had been served to Penelope, though his tone indicated that he already viewed the situation as unacceptable. Before the maid could respond, his frustration erupted. The table shook under the weight of his palm as it was slammed down in fury. His anger radiated through the room, suffocating everyone in its presence. A scathing remark was directed toward the maid, his voice laced with disgust. Even if the Duke's household were to be disrespected, a limit existed, one that had clearly been crossed. The notion that a mere servant had dared to present such filth as food for her mistress was nothing short of outrageous. The maid, terrified by his reaction, attempted to defend herself. However, her efforts were in vain. Reynolds' patience had already been exhausted, and his mind had been made up. A curt order was given, instructing her to leave the room immediately. The incident, he assured her, would not be ignored. His father and older brother would be informed of what had taken place. Without hesitation, a butler was summoned, and instructions were issued without mercy. The maid was to be taken away and locked up at once. Resistance was futile, and soon, she was led away, disappearing from sight. Only when the matter had been settled did Reynolds return his attention to Penelope. His expression had softened slightly, though concern flickered in his eyes. A question was asked, one meant to gauge her well-being. However, Penelope remained silent, her thoughts entangled in the chaos of the situation. His gaze lingered on her as he questioned her behavior. The lack of reaction on her part had been unexpected. It was pointed out that, under normal circumstances, she would have flipped the table and shouted in outrage. Instead, she had merely sat there and eaten the awful meal in silence. She clenched her fists under the table. If only he knew. Had she reacted any differently, she would have found herself dying yet again, this time with a fork lodged in her neck, all because of his interference. Words burned on her tongue, but she knew better than to speak. There were no options presented before her, no scripted responses that she was required to follow. Her gaze flickered to Reynolds' hair, the soft pink strands confirming his identity. The issue had been resolved thanks to him, but the question remained, was the maid truly the only culprit? It seemed unlikely. The entire staff shared the same contemptuous attitude. If the main figures of the household had not deliberately turned a blind eye, such mistreatment would have never been allowed to take place. Reynolds observed her for a moment longer before voicing another concern. It was noted that she did not look well. A suggestion was made, a doctor could be summoned if needed. Another wave of choices appeared before her. First was to reject the offer, stating that it was unnecessary. Second was to express irritation, demanding that he leave the room. Third was to accuse him of false kindness, telling him to stop pretending. Even now, caution was required. Every decision carried consequences, and a misstep could result in death. If she had not known the true nature of this world, she might have mistaken his words for genuine concern. However, the reality was far different. Reynolds' gestures were empty, nothing more than meaningless pleasantries. A decision was made. Without sparing him a glance, she dismissed his offer. There was no need for unnecessary trouble. For now, avoiding further conflict was the wisest choice. With a cold and indifferent tone, Reynolds informed Penelope that no doctor in the state would be willing to make time for her. His words carried an air of finality, as though the matter was not worth further discussion. Without sparing her another glance, he made it clear that she could consume whatever she wished, implying that her well-being was of no concern to him. If she wished to starve, she could do so. If she wished to overindulge, that was her choice. Even if she chose to die, it would not matter. His impatience evident, he turned away in irritation, leaving the room without another word. Left alone, Penelope observed the affection meter displayed before her. The current reading showed -3%. Her mind immediately recalled the previous night when the number had undoubtedly been at -10%. Although the increase was noted, it did not feel like an improvement. Negative numbers remained negative, after all. Even if progress had been made, it was negligible. Reaching for the nearby water basin, she cupped her hands and splashed cool water onto her face. The sensation provided a temporary relief, allowing her thoughts to settle. Her reflection in the mirror was then examined with quiet contemplation. The same thoughts that had crossed her mind while playing the game resurfaced. Now that she was physically experiencing this world, those thoughts felt even more solidified. Penelope Eckhart was undeniably beautiful. Had she not fought so hard for her independence, she might have considered this transformation a blessing. But in reality, this existence was far from a gift. The magenta strands of her hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing striking turquoise eyes. The features were just as they had been depicted in the game. And yet, despite this undeniable beauty, there was a sharpness to her face, something cold and unapproachable. It was as though the very essence of a villainess had been etched into her features, making it impossible to be mistaken for anyone else. A vague memory surfaced, prompting her to recall the game's description of Penelope. What had been written about this character? Concentrating, she sifted through her memories, bringing forth the introductory text that had once been displayed in the game. Penelope Eckhart had been described as the adopted daughter of Duke Eckhart, a noble figure within the Empire of Yorka. The Duke's household was considered one of the most prestigious in the empire, commanding immense influence and power. However, the origins of the young woman were far removed from the nobility she had been forced to adopt. Her early years had been spent as a commoner, raised by a widowed mother who had made a living as a traveling merchant. Life had been filled with hardships, and resources had always been scarce. At the age of 12, her life had taken a drastic turn when illness had claimed her mother's life. Alone and vulnerable, she had caught the attention of Duke Eckhart, whose own daughter had been lost years prior. Due to her resemblance to the missing girl, she had been taken in and granted the title of an adopted noblewoman. But acceptance had not truly been given. As the years passed, it became apparent that she lacked the defining characteristic of House Eckhart, the blue eyes that symbolized the family lineage. With the absence of that single feature, the warmth she had once received from her adoptive father quickly diminished. She was neither fully embraced as a daughter nor treated with the respect befitting a noblewoman. Eventually, she became nothing more than an afterthought, a shadow in the grand halls of the estate. Ignored by the Duke and ostracized by those around her, Penelope had forged a reputation for herself, one that was far from desirable. She had been labeled a troublemaker, a wicked girl who stirred chaos wherever she went. The world saw her as nothing more than a villainess. Penelope found herself reflecting on the injustice of it all. The Duke should have searched harder for his real daughter. Why had an innocent girl been forced into this position? She had been reduced to nothing more than a stand-in, an inferior replacement for the real heroine. And the more she thought about it, the more she saw the similarities between herself and the Penelope from the game. She, too, had lived in poverty before being taken in by those who held power over her life. She, too, had experienced the pain of isolation after losing the favor of those around her. While playing the game, these parallels had not been noticed. But now, as she lived within this world, they were impossible to ignore. The difference, however, was that she had managed to escape her own reality. She had endured years of suffering but had eventually found her freedom. Admission into a prestigious college had been earned through her hard work. A place of her own had been secured, even if it had been cramped and worn down. For the first time, she had been able to breathe without fear. She had escaped. So why had she been dragged back into another cycle of suffering? This situation was far from normal. It was worse than anything she had imagined. In just a single day, she had already experienced the treatment Penelope had endured in this household. The cruelty was ingrained in the very fabric of her new reality. If even the bare minimum of human decency had existed in this world, such abuse would have been unthinkable. No formally adopted daughter of a duke should have been subjected to mistreatment. No matter how unwanted or wicked she was believed to be, the hostility directed toward her was unjustifiable. But the true tragedy was the age at which this mistreatment had begun. At 12 years old, Penelope had been powerless. If the abuse had started then, what chance had she ever had? She had been silenced before she could even fight back. Was this, then, the reason for her descent into villainy? No child could resist when the adults around them refused to listen. No matter how much she had cried out, her voice had never reached anyone. And now, she was Penelope. Just as in the game, the threat of death loomed over her. The male characters could end her life at any given moment. Taking a deep breath, she seated herself at the desk, picking up a sheet of paper and a pen. There was no other option but to remain calm. If survival was to be ensured, a plan had to be made. The first step was to organize the information at her disposal. What kind of game world had she entered? The system had already provided key details. It had been made clear that hard mode was an incredibly difficult setting. Gaining affection was an arduous process, and losing it was alarmingly easy. Unlike normal mode, where affection began at 30%, hard mode started at 0. Worse still, the special male protagonists had negative affection from the beginning. If that affection remained below 0, the probability of a bad ending, and ultimately, her death, was dangerously high. Her thoughts turned to the characters within the game. A total of 5 male protagonists existed in this world. At that moment, a prompt appeared before her, presenting an option. Would you like to read the character introductions? Without hesitation, the choice was made. The information needed to be known. Seated at her desk, Penelope Eckhart tapped the end of her quill against the parchment, her expression carefully composed as she contemplated her next move. The information at her disposal needed to be thoroughly analyzed and organized, for without a proper strategy, her survival in this world would remain uncertain. A deep breath was taken, steadying her thoughts. The first name that required attention was Derek Eckhart. A brief glance at the rough sketch of his profile revealed what was already known. At 24 years old, he stood at 6 feet and 1 inch, embodying the essence of a noble who was both severe and cold. As the eldest son and heir to the Eckhart dukedom, his life revolved around a singular goal, inheriting the title. No interest had ever been shown towards Penelope, and it had been made painfully clear that his disdain for her ran deep. Despite their shared household, Derek's interactions with her had always been marked by hostility. The contempt in his gaze had often been noticed, though its true origin had already been understood. To him, Penelope was nothing more than a fraud, a replacement for his younger sister, Yvonne, who had been lost long ago. Though no outward accusations had ever been made, the hatred he bore toward her had always been unmistakable. Another name was written down next, Reynold Eckhart, the second son of the Duke. Compared to Derek, Reynolds' hostility had always been far less subtle. Known for his quick temper and reckless speech, he had never hesitated to express his dislike for Penelope, taking every opportunity to provoke her. A particular fondness for causing trouble had been observed in him, making it necessary for extreme caution to be exercised in his presence. A sigh escaped her lips as she observed the names written before her. These two individuals had always been difficult, and even within the original game, they had been labeled as obstacles. However, in normal mode, their roles had been significantly different. Back then, the normal ending had required nothing more than reuniting them with Yvonne, ensuring the restoration of their once harmonious family. Their affections had not needed to be won over because the plot had already dictated their eventual reconciliation with their real sister. Now, however, the situation had changed. Penelope was not Yvonne, and in this hard mode, a vastly different story had begun to unfold. With careful deliberation, their names were crossed out. No hope had been found in trying to alter their paths, especially when one of them had begun with a negative affection score. This had been no mere coincidence, it had been a deliberate design by the game's creator, a subtle indication that these two should be abandoned early. Her attention then shifted to another name, the Crown Prince, Callisto Regulus. The mere thought of him sent a chill down her spine. As the ruler-to-be of the Empire of Iorka, Callisto was a tyrant whose cruelty was legendary. It had been said that he regarded human lives as insignificant, treating them as though they were nothing more than flies. However, the question had always remained, what had turned him into such a monster? Penelope recalled the original game's storyline. Within normal mode, it had been shown that Callisto's merciless nature had undergone a transformation upon encountering Yvonne. The heroine's presence had softened his heart, reshaping his character into that of a noble ruler. The villainess, Penelope, had then been subjected to severe punishment at his hands. An event that had been framed as righteous justice. However, the situation in hard mode had been far worse. Unlike in normal mode, where his cruelty had been eventually tamed, the Crown Prince had remained just as ruthless throughout. It had been by his hands that Penelope had met her demise more times than she could count. Countless restarts had been caused by him. Each time, his blade had ended her life before progress could be made. His name was swiftly crossed out, a firm decision having been made, no involvement with him would be pursued under any circumstances. Her gaze then fell upon the next name, Winter Verdandi, the Marquis of House Verdandi and a powerful sorcerer. A peculiar figure, Winter had often been found hiding his true identity, choosing instead to masquerade as an eccentric merchant who traded in information and artifacts. In normal mode, his role had been instrumental in revealing Yvonne's identity. Each time Penelope had attempted to sabotage Yvonne, Winter had interfered, exposing her plots with precise and detailed knowledge. He had been one of the strongest allies of the heroine, ensuring her rise to fame by offering support and resources. His words had always been elegant, his demeanor courteous, and his affections devoted entirely to Yvonne. But in hard mode, his position had remained unclear. Too little interaction had taken place between them, as her time had been spent dying at the hands of the Crown Prince and her brothers. After a brief moment of hesitation, his name was left untouched. Unlike the previous three, he seemed to hold some potential, though whether it was for good or ill remained uncertain. Finally, her thoughts settled on Eccles, the apprentice knight of House Eckhart. Among the five, he held the most promise. Once a noble of a now fallen kingdom, Eccles had been enslaved by the victorious nation, his status stripped away. It had been during an evening outing that his swordsmanship skills had been noticed by Duke Eckhart, who had purchased him in exchange for a great sum. Unlike the others, he had been the only love interest who had ever shown sympathy towards Penelope, perhaps due to his past allegiance to a former mistress. In normal mode, his stance had been neutral, even during Penelope and Yvonne's conflicts. Though their paths had yet to cross in hard mode, a silent decision was made: if survival was to be ensured, he was the best possible ally. Yet, despite everything, a significant problem remained. Her knowledge was limited. The game's original system had not been fully understood in this reality, making it impossible to determine which rules still applied. However, two objectives were clear: first, the affection scores of the male protagonists must never reach negative values, and second, an ending must be achieved before Penelope's coming-of-age ceremony. That day, the true heroine, Yvonne, would return. If no path had been secured by then, the story would shift into normal mode, and the male protagonists would turn against her. That would mean certain death. The risk of a game over loomed over everything. If it happened, no alternative paths would remain, only death awaited. But such a fate would not be accepted. After escaping one cruel reality, death in this fabricated world would not be tolerated. A way to survive would be found. A return to her own life would be ensured. Her resolve solidified. At that moment, a knock was heard at the door, followed by the entrance of a butler, who informed her that the Duke was summoning her. As Penelope Eckhart stood before the butler, her gaze lingered on him with mild disbelief. Without waiting for a response, he had taken the liberty of opening the door to the Duke's daughter's room. The audacity of such an action did not go unnoticed by her. Even the servants who had once worked for her own family had exercised more restraint. Was this not considered rude behavior? Should she not be offended? The choice to be angry was not something she could even decide for herself in this place. Before she could dwell too long on the matter, a familiar notification appeared before her eyes. 3 options were presented to her, each carrying its own consequences. The first suggested that she throw something at him in retaliation. The second instructed her to call him forward and demand that he enter properly. The third simply allowed her to accept the situation as it was. After considering her options, she concluded that the third was the safest course of action. With a quiet resignation, the decision was made. A thought surfaced in her mind: perhaps, in some way, this had worked out for the best. Fortune appeared to favor her at this moment, as it seemed that the Duke had been seeking her presence. If she handled the situation correctly, she might be able to take advantage of this unexpected opportunity. A similar situation had unfolded in her previous life. The memory was as vivid as ever. She had once approached her father with an acceptance letter in hand, eager to share her accomplishment. She had expected, if not warmth, then at least some form of acknowledgement. Instead, she had been met with indifference. A single glance had been cast at the letter before a question had been asked, a question that carried no trace of interest or approval. It had been implied that there must have been another reason for her visit. That response had devastated her. The letter had not simply been a statement of achievement, it had been a plea, an unspoken request for validation. Summoning her courage, she had then asked for permission to move out, expressing her wish to live near the university while attending school. It had not been an unreasonable request. The answer she had received had been brief and devoid of emotion. Permission had been granted, and she had been told to make the necessary preparations. The memory had only strengthened her resolve. Her acceptance into a prestigious university had never been about gaining her family's approval. The efforts she had put into her studies had never been meant to earn their recognition. Everything had been done for one reason alone, to escape. To long for love from those who had treated her worse than a pet had been a mistake she would not make again. Now, standing outside the Duke's office in this unfamiliar world, she was reminded once more of that same suffocating feeling. The weight of judgment pressed upon her as the maids in the hallway exchanged hushed whispers. Their glances were not unfamiliar to her. In her past life, similar looks had been directed at her, though their meaning had always remained unspoken. The butler, having led her to the room, formally announced her arrival. The Duke was informed that Lady Penelope had been brought before him, and in response, permission for her entry was granted. The heavy doors opened, revealing the figure of the Duke seated at the table. The sight of him in that position caused a sudden realization to strike her. This scene was eerily reminiscent of the life she had left behind. Her father had always occupied his seat at the head of the table in the exact same manner, his presence radiating a cold authority that had once been inescapable. Once again, the system presented her with three possible responses. The first prompted her to question the Duke's reason for summoning her. The second suggested that she demand he get straight to the point. The third encouraged her to remain silent and simply observe him. After careful consideration, she selected the first option. A question was directed toward the Duke regarding the reason for this summons. In response, he addressed the matter that had occurred earlier in the morning, stating that he had been informed of a disturbance. Three new choices appeared before her. The first assured the Duke that there was no need for concern. The second implied that trouble had been something he had been expecting. The third placed the blame entirely on the actions of an incompetent maid. None of the choices were ideal. She found herself once again frustrated by the system's limitations. It was no wonder that Penelope, as a character, had been so disliked. Who would look favorably upon an adopted daughter who lacked both grace and tact? A fleeting thought crossed her mind: why had she ever chosen the second option when playing this game before? Perhaps, had Penelope's features resembled those of the Duke's true daughters, there might have been hope for even the smallest thread of compassion from him. But as things stood, such hope was meaningless. What mattered now was survival. Every choice carried consequences, and she needed to navigate this conversation without stepping into dangerous territory. After a moment of hesitation, she selected the safest response. She assured the Duke that the matter was not significant enough to warrant his concern. His expression remained unchanged as he addressed her once more. A reminder was given: it had been 6 years since she had entered the Eckhart household. The realization struck her. 6 years. That was correct. The heroine of the game was also 18, which meant. Her thoughts raced. The coming-of-age ceremonies in this world were held on one's 18th birthday. The question that now loomed over her was a crucial one: how much time remained before the Duke's real daughter returned? The Duke continued speaking, explaining that entry into the Eckhart household was not a simple matter. Those who had been allowed through its doors had only done so after proving their worth through rigorous testing. Since adopting her, he had not withheld resources nor denied any of her extravagant requests. However, he remained unconvinced of what worth she had demonstrated over the past 6 years. Once again, the system presented three choices. The first implied that she expected to be cast out. The second asserted that she had done nothing wrong. The third instructed her to kneel and accept responsibility while addressing him as father. The sight of the third option caused a sense of understanding to settle within her. She recalled her first experience playing this game. The sheer number of features and choices had felt overwhelming at the time. Had games truly evolved into such complex systems? And had she really needed to activate these functions to progress? Now, however, no such uncertainty plagued her. Without hesitation, she followed the prompt, lowering herself onto her knees and offering an apology. She took responsibility and addressed the Duke with the title that had long been unfamiliar to her. A visible reaction flickered across his face. Surprise was evident as the words were repeated back to her. The name she had spoken, the one she had been instructed to use, was acknowledged. At that moment, a system notification appeared before her. Hidden quest achieved, Father, the forgotten name. Another prompt followed immediately after. Would you like to disable multiple choice answers? The message lingered before her, awaiting a decision. It was further stated that without the predefined responses, she would have complete control over her actions and words, enabling a more in-depth and unrestricted experience. Additionally, fulfilling certain special conditions would lead to the unlocking of exclusive events. The implications of this decision were weighed carefully in her mind. In her real life, this function had been disregarded, as it had seemed unnecessary at the time. However, given the circumstances she now found herself in, the value of this feature was recognized. If her assumptions were correct, then disabling the multiple-choice answers would be crucial for ensuring her survival in this unpredictable world. Without hesitation, the option was selected, and at that moment, the restrictive guidance that had previously dictated her responses disappeared. A newfound sense of control washed over her. For the first time, words were spoken freely, without being dictated by the system's predetermined choices. When she addressed the Duke as her father, visible shock was seen in his expression. It was immediately understood that the change had worked. Now, movements and speech could be made without being bound by external commands. A realization struck her. Something as simple as the ability to speak of her own volition had never been appreciated before, and yet, now it felt like an immense privilege. With this new freedom, a composed yet humble tone was adopted while speaking to the Duke. Acknowledgement was made of the trouble she had caused during her probation, and an apology was extended for the scandal that had arisen due to improper conduct with a subordinate. A promise was made that deep reflection would be undertaken throughout the remaining period of her probation. Although the morning's events had not been her fault, arguing that point seemed both unnecessary and detrimental. The reality of the situation was understood. Penelope had been the victim, yet taking a defensive stance would not be in her best interest. Considering the behavior associated with her character until now, any sign of stubbornness would only serve to harm her further. A realization dawned upon her that in this world, survival depended on demonstrating humility, even when it was undeserved. Continuing with her plea, an admission was made regarding the childish and arrogant behavior she had exhibited over the years. A sincere promise was voiced, that efforts would be made to prove her worth until her coming-of-age ceremony. A request was then placed before the Duke, seeking forgiveness for this one mistake. A long silence filled the room before a response was finally given. In a measured tone, the Duke instructed her to rise from the floor. A warning was then issued, stating that an Eckhart's words were never to be taken lightly, and it was advised that the opportunity earned that day should not be wasted. With a composed demeanor, appreciation was expressed for his words before she turned away and carefully exited the room. As the heavy doors were shut behind her, a deep breath was taken. Relief coursed through her veins as the weight of the encounter settled in her mind. Somehow, she had managed to navigate through the situation without worsening her circumstances. Uncertainty lingered about whether the decision made had been the best one, but at the very least, it had been enough for now. The thought was entertained that the Duke was not someone whose favor needed to be sought. The only thing that mattered was that she had emerged from the room alive. However, before the relief could fully take hold, a cold and disapproving voice reached her ears. A statement was made, reminding her of the strict instruction that had been given. She had been told to remain quiet and unseen, as if she did not exist. The words were spoken with an unmistakable edge of disdain. Upon turning, the sight of Derek Eckhart greeted her. His unreadable gaze held an unmistakable intensity, and displeasure radiated from his stance. Without hesitation, a direct remark was made regarding the fate of Emily, a maid who had served the household with unwavering loyalty for nearly 10 years. It was revealed that she had been expelled from the palace, and the blame was placed entirely on Penelope. The discontent in Derek's voice left no room for doubt. His anger was deeply rooted in the dismissal of the maid, an action that he seemed to hold against her. Her gaze briefly flickered to the love meter hovering above him. A grim realization set in, it had already plummeted to 0%. With barely concealed frustration, he continued to express his disdain. It was conveyed that despite offers of increased pay, no one had been willing to serve as her lady's maid. Emily had been the only one willing to tolerate her, the only one who had made any effort to maintain peace in her presence. And yet, even that had come to an end that day. A pointed question was then thrown at her: was she satisfied now that she had caused such an uproar and driven away the only maid who had shown her even a shred of loyalty? Internally, a surge of exasperation rose within her. The accusation was unfair. In truth, she had never been the one to cause an uproar. It had been her brother who had escalated the situation unnecessarily. She had been the one placed in danger, nearly losing her life over a simple meal that had turned out to be tainted. However, voicing these thoughts would only be futile. At that moment, another system notification appeared before her. 3 response options were presented, each likely to dictate the course of her next interaction. Without hesitation, the multiple-choice options were once again disabled, allowing her to take control of her words. A brief pause settled between them before Derek made another statement, this time with a sharper tone. It was demanded whether she now believed that his words were not worthy of a response. In a carefully measured voice, a respectful apology was extended. The words chosen were deliberate, acknowledging the trouble caused while maintaining an air of humility. He had been addressed formally as, "My lord," a decision that took him by complete surprise. A flicker of disbelief was briefly visible in his expression before it was masked once more. While maintaining a composed exterior, frustration boiled within her. How many more times would she be expected to lower her head for crimes she had not committed? A flood of memories from her childhood surfaced. In her past life, blame had always been assigned to her without reason. Regardless of innocence, accusations had been thrown at her, and nothing she had done had ever been enough to prove otherwise. With that painful recollection in mind, further words were spoken. Agreement was given to Derek's accusations, an admission was made that, as he had pointed out, she had failed to recognize her place. Responsibility was taken for not conducting herself properly, and acknowledgement was given that the blame lay with her. However, it was suggested that the maid did not need to be cast aside. The fact that the Duke's forgiveness had already been sought was then stated. A final assurance was given, that from this moment forward, no actions would be taken that might attract Derek's attention. A request for forgiveness was made once more, with the assurance that if necessary, she would continue to beg as much as he desired. Yet, even as the words left her lips, bitterness filled her heart. Her pride still existed. Lowering herself in such a way felt degrading, humiliating. But she reminded herself that it was a necessary act for survival. And just like before, she would do it again. As Penelope's words hung in the air, the tension between her and Derek remained thick, his expression unreadable yet filled with something dangerously close to contempt. Would her carefully chosen humility be enough to pacify him, or had she only managed to deepen his resentment? And as she struggled to maintain her composure, unaware of what awaited her next, had she truly secured her safety, or merely stepped into an even greater storm? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.